Okay, so welcome to our class today, Learn to Knit with Marley Bird. My name is Jenny. I'm with favecrafts.com, and we are excited to be here today with Marley. Marley, thank you so much for leading the show today and teaching us all how to knit.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
We are sponsored by our friends today at ilikeknitting.com. If you want to switch slides, Marley.
Okay.
We do have an offer for you guys today. It's an exclusive offer for the I Like Knitting Gold Club. So if you're not familiar with I Like Knitting, it's a digital knitting magazine. And we do have this great offer today for just $11.88. You get access to a one-year subscription to I Like Knitting magazine. So once you take this class and figure out how to knit and practice your skills, you'll have access to all of these wonderful patterns at your disposal to practice your skills with. So you get instant access. You'll actually get access to all of the back issues as well. They publish 6 times a year, so you'll get more than 700 patterns. They've all been tech edited. There's no advertisements. Patterns range, as you can see a couple of the previous issues here, you have scarves, shawls, hats, afghans, really anything and everything, any type of pattern that you're looking for, you can find it in I Like Knitting. So that offer is good, exclusive deal just for you guys today that are joining us. So if you have any questions about the offer, any questions about the class, like I said, please feel free to use the Q&A feature down below, and we will do our best to answer either during the class. We can reply back to your question in the Q&A section, or if I see a lot of people have a similar question, asking the same thing, I'll actually try to get that question answered live for you during the event with Marley. So yeah, I guess we can go ahead and dive right in.
All right, so I'm going to stop screen share. And hello, everybody. So thank you, Jenny, for that. And I guess I'm just going to jump in with everything. Are you cool with that?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So I don't know if you have everybody on my hands or on my face right now. It's on my hands.
It's on your hands.
Do you want to start at my face first,
Sure.
and then we'll go to my hands?
Yeah.
Cool. And everybody can still hear me when it was on my hands, right? I just want to confirm we're all good there. Sweet. Hi. Hello, everyone. I am so grateful to have you here. If you don't know who I am, my name is Marley Bird. I have been knitting and crocheting for several years, but I have been in this business for about 15 years now. And teaching people how to become new knitters or new crocheters is one of the highlights of what I get to do, because I love it when all of you out there at some point in time, whether it's in the hour-long time that I have here with you or over the next couple of weeks, you are going to have an aha moment of how this whole thing works. And you just kind of feel like all of a sudden it's like you learned to ride a bike. Like it's just this next level. You just learned something really cool. So I'm excited to be able to get you started on that journey. I know that the team over at Fave Crafts has already sent you the list of materials and everything that you need. I do want you to know I'm going to be using some circular needles today, but because you probably don't know, circular needles can be used as straight needles. So I'm not going to be working in the round. I'm going to treat these as if they are straight needles. They just happen to be joined down here. So if you can use your imagination, like I snip this in half and they're just 2 separate needles, that's essentially what I'm doing. But the short part of the needle makes it easier for me to show you on camera with circular. So I just wanted to explain why I'm using these and not straights, because a lot of you, this could be the first time you've ever seen what are called circular needles. You've probably always seen those really long needles that you see at the store or on TV or on movies. This is just another knitting needle. It's another tool. Okay. Along with that, I'm using some basic worsted weight yarn in a bright yellow color. I'm hoping it'll help you see the stitches. And the last thing I have is a tapestry needle. It's a bent tip tapestry needle. I don't know if you can see how that is right there. And you will use that to weave in your ends. You don't need it precisely for today, but this is something that you're definitely going to need overall. Before we jump in, I want to have everybody agree to one little tiny rule that I have, okay? And that is, I want you to give yourself a little bit of grace and be patient with yourself. Knitting is a skill that takes a little bit of time to learn just because of the muscle memory. mentally, you're going to be like, oh, I understand. She's telling me to do this. All right, I'm going to do it. And your hands are like, what? You want me to what? You know? And so you're just like, what is going on? Why won't you do what I want you to do? And it can be a little bit frustrating, especially as a lot of us are adults and we are used to just picking up on things and just moving forward and everything's awesome. We do have to remember that we are retraining our hands to do something different. And so our mind and our eyes are telling our hands what to do. We just need to have a little bit of time to create that neural pathway to make that transition, is that the word? I'm not even sure. Have the neural pathway work. So I just want you to be patient with yourself is all. I give yourself a little bit of credit to even take this class and step forward and become a knitter. Like that's the first step, right? So that's the only rule. You're not allowed to get frustrated with yourself. Okay.
Real quick, hang on. I just want to jump in. We are recording the class and we will be emailing out a recording of the class afterwards. So if you get discouraged, if you need to go back and like rewatch something, we're going to have to kind of go kind of fast today because we are only here for an hour and we're going to try to squeeze a lot into the hour. So I don't know if we'll be able to go back and show things, you know, over and over again, but luckily that is why we were recording it. And I will email the video to everyone after so you can go back and rewatch as many times as you need. So.
Perfect. Yep. And I try and at least show you a couple times. And so that way you have a couple chances to see it, but it's okay. Even if you end up sitting back and just watching, you're going to be just fine. All right, everybody, here we go. Let's go to the hands, Jenny. We're diving in. I've pulled up my sleeves and everything. We're set. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my hands. I have 2 knitting needles here. Now, whether you're using straight needles or circular needles, you're going to hold your needles primarily the same way. For the majority of knitters now today, you hold your needles in this fashion. Some older fashioned knitters actually will hold their needles like a pencil in this way. It's real different. And then there are some needles who only use the long knitting needle and they'll tuck one needle underneath their armpit and then use this needle to knit off of. My whole point of saying all of that to you is there is no technical right way to hold your knitting needles. You do what works best for you. Okay. I tend to hold my knitting needles just like this. I will also hold my knitting needles close to the tip of my needle. I know a lot of beginner knitters will hold their needles back here. Okay. We're not playing swords. This isn't the Mandalorian or anything like that. Okay. We're back here. We want to make sure we're up here and we're going to control whatever stitches we have, whether they're on this needle or this needle. We're going to control those. I tend to control them either with my pointer finger or my middle finger. I don't let them drop off the needle unless I let them drop off the needle. I don't get to control many things in life, but I can control my stitches. Okay. So that's really important because a lot of you might start off by holding your needles back here, but I want you really get up in it. Get up here. This is where I want you to be. Now, having said that, you'll notice that your knitting needle is not a little bit, it's tapered. The reason is as the knit stitch is resting on your needle, the size of the stitch is determined by this part of the knitting needle. See how it's bigger than the tapered section? So when you're making your stitches, you want your stitches to reach up to this part so that they can fit. If you only make your stitches down here in the tapered section, they're going to end up being too tight and never really get past the knitting part. It's not going to be enjoyable. So that's why you have different size knitting needles. So that way you have different size stitches and you want your stitch to meet your needle up here in the barrel section. Okay. All right, when we start off knitting, we have to start off with a canvas or a piece of fabric or what we call a cast on. So we're gonna put stitches on a needle so that way we can begin working onto them, okay? And when I'm teaching beginner knitters, I like to teach what's called the knitted cast on. So this is called the knitted cast on. Now I'm also going to tell you there are at least 40 different cast ons in the world. So if this cast on is not something you enjoy and you want to try another one, there are many out there. I know I have some on my own YouTube channel. I'm sure there's some on Fave Crafts. There's just a lot of tutorials out there for other cast ons. But I think this one is a great one to use as a transition from a cast on to a knit stitch. We're going to start off by placing a slip knot onto our needle. So to create a slip knot, I take my working yarn. So I have my tail here. The tail goes into the palm of my hand. I take my working yarn. I wrap it around my forefinger and my middle finger. And when I come back up, I cross over. I rotate my hand and I go underneath that front loop and grab the back loop and let them come off my fingers. You see how I create that little knot right there? As I pull the legs, I get that slip knot right there that I then can place directly onto my needle. All right, I'm going to show you guys how to do that one more time. The tail of the yarn in the palm of your hand. Take your working yarn, going over top of your forefinger, going down underneath your middle finger and back up, and then cross that loop or that string over the first one. Okay, you guys see that? So I crossed over, rotate my hand underneath this front loop, grab that back, pull it off, and tug. Now I have a slip knot. Put it on my needle, spread the legs apart, and it snugs it right up. Okay? Now, unlike crochet, this slip knot actually counts as a stitch, unless a pattern tells you otherwise. If a pattern is going to later have you drop that slip knot, it will tell you. But when you're knitting, that actually counts as one stitch. Okay, in crochet, that's not the case. In crochet, you never count the loop on your hook as a stitch, but knitting is different. So that counts as one. We're going to ultimately cast on 10. So that's our goal here, okay? I'm going to show you today how to hold the yarn in your right hand. And if I get a chance, I'll show you how to hold the yarn in your left hand. This is called English. This is called continental. The action of knitting is done the same. It's just a matter of how you hold your yarn. That's the only difference. So either way you decide works best for you, what's comfortable for you is the best way, okay? So I have my slip knot on my needle and I've placed that needle in my left hand. Notice I have that slip knot right up here, real close to the tapered section. And if I let it go into the tapered section, see how it gives me a little bit of extra room? If it's up here, it's the same size as my needle. But if I let it go down to the tapered section, it gives me that little extra room. That's why your needles are tapered. It gives you that extra room to take your right hand needle and going from left to right, going into the front leg of that stitch and putting it in. All right. So I'm going from left and I'm going to have it go into that stitch and go in. Once I have that in there, what you need to do essentially is grasp both needles. And this will become easier with time, you guys. This is tricky when you first start for sure. Grasp both needles. We're going to take this yarn and we're going to go underneath the needle that we put into the stitch. We're going to go underneath it and around and back up. Okay, I'm going to do that again. Our yarn is back here. We're going to go underneath, around, and back around. Okay, that's called yarning over your needle. All right, around, just like this. I do not want you to go like that. That's different. You must go like this. Now, our goal here is to take this yarn we just put over that needle and pull it through that loop or that slip knot that we put onto our other needle. So I have re-grasped my needles. Okay, so now I have one in each hand. I'm maintaining tension on my yarn. Again, you guys, this will come easier with time, okay? It's tricky at the first start. But our ultimate goal here is we want to take our needle and we're going to come back out that stitch the same way we went in, but we're going to bring that yarn with us. Okay, so I'm going to do that again. I go into the stitch, I go around the needle, and then I'm going to come out the stitch. You see how I brought that yarn with me? And I still have the stitch on my left-hand needle. Now that we've pulled that stitch out, what we want to do is place this new stitch onto our left-hand needle. So that way we can get 2 stitches cast on. So I'm going to extend this right-hand needle. So it's essentially extending that loop that I just pulled through. And this is really important. Okay, you guys ready? We're going to take our left-hand needle. I'm going to swivel so I can get underneath that loop and scoop it up and place it on. Don't worry, we're going to do it again. So even if you didn't get that first one, you can still do this again. So now I have 2 loops on my needle, or 2 stitches cast on. I'm going to go here to the one that I just put on. I'm going to go in, going from left to right. I go into the stitch, wrap around my right-hand needle, come out of the stitch, extend, swivel, and scoop. Because I know a lot of you are visual, I'm just going to do it without saying anything, all right? Which is going to be difficult for me because I like to talk. You guys see that?
We do have a few questions.
Sure.
Costco is saying, I recently have struggled with the loops being too snug against the needle. Do I need to loosen how tight I wrap around?
So
And Ellen is asking, she says her mom generally casts on to the next larger needle to prevent casting on too tight using long tail. Is that useful?
you can do that as well. And long tail is a completely different cast on. So if your stitches are too tight, you absolutely could change to a larger needle to cast onto and then go to the needle you want to use for sure. What you will find here though, is if you yarn over and pull that yarn through, as you're coming up, swivel and scoop, and you put that on, see how it's loose right now? It gets tightened up once I pull my working yarn. I just want to make sure I'm not pulling that working yarn so tight that, see how, I want you to notice this. See that little bump right there? If I pull it real tight, see how it really cinches up? I don't want that. You don't want these to be so tight on your needle. I'm actually just going to drop that. You don't want them so tight on your needle that you can't have them move. So that's like a really good test. In my beginner knitting classes, I usually would tell the knitters, you want to make sure you can move the stitches comfortably on your knitting needle. If they're too snug, if it's like this and you're forcing them to move, that's not good. Start over. But we want them to be loose enough that they can move, but not so loose that when I put my needle upside down that they fall off. Okay? You guys see that?
Karen
But if, go
asking,
ahead.
does it matter if you wrap around needles from front to back or back to front?
Yes, it does. We want to make sure, if you go from, so I'm back here, if I go from this way over top and I put that stitch on my needle, it doesn't, see how it lays funny? It lays like it wants to turn on me. It's just not, it's not the way I want my stitch to be. It's important that you wrap your yarn this way. And it's also important too, so a lot of people will extend and then they'll think, oh, the big hole is right there, I'll just dip into it and put it on, right? See what it does? You see how it makes it look like that? We don't want that. We don't want just a dip. That's why it's important to swivel and scoop, because that makes it a nice little twist there at the bottom and it just makes a nice cleaner edge. So you're in, around, out, extend, swivel, scoop. In, around, out, extend, swivel, scoop. In, around, out, extend, swivel, scoop. How you guys doing? I have one more to cast on here. So in, around, out, extend, swivel, and scoop.
Judy has an interesting question. She's wondering, can you cast on without using both needles, just using your hand?
Yes, if we were going to use a long tail cast on, you could use, you mean, oh, is she talking about like the backwards E like this? So there's this cast on, but I want you to notice the difference between this one. Remember I told you guys there's like 40 different cast ons out there, right? So this is a cast on a lot of people will do. They're like, oh, it's so easy, I'm just going to do this. But I want you to look at the difference here. First off, see how this one has a really nice bottom edge to it? And this one is sort of loosey-goosey. It just doesn't even want to stay on the needle right. And then the minute I start knitting this one, it gets like this really long tail. So this is an easy cast on, but it is not that this is not one I would recommend for the beginning of a project at all, because it just leaves a really unsightly beginning. All right. So it's much better to start, in my opinion, with a knitted cast on. My preferred method is a long tail cast on or a cable cast on, but this is a really good one for beginners to start. And you guys are going to learn why here right now. Are you guys ready for this? Okay. We've used what's called the knitted cast on to cast on our stitches. And now we're going to jump directly into knitting. And it's going to be such an easy transition because you've essentially been knitting all of these stitches, but we've been putting them on the needle. So this is going to be our first row of knitting, okay? I'm going to go into the stitch. Oh, just like we did before. I'm going to go around the needle just like we did before. I'm going to come out the stitch just like we did before. This is where it's different. Instead of extending, swiveling, and scooping, I'm going to let that stitch that we went into jump off my needle. So I'm going to push it off. Okay. Now I am not going to take my needles at this point and separate them apart. We do not do that. We want our needles just like this, nice and close together. The other thing is, once we let that stitch jump off, that's our stitch. If I take my yarn now and I pull it real tight, see how it pulls? I don't know if you can see that. Here's the stitch that jumped off. If I take my yarn and pull it real tight, see how it makes that distance from where that stitch is and that right there, like really short? That is now the size of your new stitch. We don't want that. We want our new stitch to be the size of our needle, right? We want it to be that size. So do not knit it and then give it a really big pull thinking, oh, I'm just gonna make that a nice tight stitch. That's not what we want. Now I'm dropping stitches all over the place because I was messing with stuff. So I'm gonna cast on a couple stitches here real quick. Am I going at a good pace? Is this good for everybody?
Yeah, I mean,
Hopefully.
a few people are wanting you to slow the pace down, but we are already at 123, so we're almost
Okay.
halfway through the class.
Yeah, I need to
It's
get
crazy.
going. So here's the cool thing, guys. So as I said, this cast on transitions directly into knitting. So we're going to start knitting here. I'm going to go into the stitch, yarn over the needle, out the stitch, just like we did before. And then I'm going to let that stitch on my left-hand needle jump off. Now I'm going to hold that so it doesn't go anywhere. I'm going to go into the next stitch on my left-hand needle, and I'm going to do the same thing around the needle, out the stitch, and let that stitch jump off. In, around, out, off. In, around, out, off. In, around, out, off. In, around, out, off. And as you're doing this, you're essentially like a typewriter, just working across all of those stitches you cast on, and you're working a row of knitting, sort of like a row of netting. You're just pulling a loop through the loops you had already put on your needle. So now you have all your stitches over on your right hand needle. Below the stitches that are on your needle, underneath it, those are the ones you did your cast on with. And now we want to knit into these stitches. So what you will do is you take this needle and you put it into your left hand, and you grab your empty needle and put it into your right hand, and you start again. Now, as you're doing this, now that we've transitioned and put these stitches over here, can you see that you have these little bumps right here on the back of the stitches? You're probably like, I didn't see those before. Why are those there? Well, those are purl bumps. And yes, you did a knit stitch, but now you're looking at purl bumps. And that's because the back side of the knit stitch is a bump. Just like if you're looking at a quarter and you're looking at heads on the side you're looking at, on the back side is tails. Well, if I am looking at knits, I know on the back side are purls. So as I transition and put my needle over here, I'm going to be looking at purls. The reason I'm pointing that out is this last stitch here, or the first stitch that we're going to knit to, it looks a little loose. And a lot of beginners will think, well, I want that tightened up. So they pull that yarn up just like that. They're like, oh yeah, that looks tighter. Man, I am killing it now, man. My stitches look great. But what they've done is they've pulled up the stitch that we let jump off, and now it looks like it's 2 stitches. So then they accidentally increase, and we don't want to do that. So it's important, as we're working what this is called garter stitch, knitting every row, it's important we see that purl bump right there here at the beginning. Even though that looks a little bit loose, it's going to be just fine. You're going to go into that first stitch just like before, yarn over, out, and off. So let's get through a couple of rows with this because this is really important. So do you guys see what I mean about the cast on is just like almost exactly like a basic knit stitch. So even though we spend a lot of time on the cast on there at the beginning, we're still learning a knit stitch. So that way when we transition to just basic knitting, it's not that hard of a transition. You get to the end. I like to always kind of make my work kind of come down. You always want your work to flow down the needles. You never want it to be flowing up the needle like that. You want it to be working down the needle. Put the needle in your left hand. Everything's in place. Make sure I'm not pulling that up to get 2 stitches. I want to make sure I only have 1 stitch there. And I do it again. We're just going to keep doing this with these 10 stitches.
Marie is asking, after you cast on, is it necessary to pull the right hand needle out of the stitch when you are going to put it back in to cast another?
If it's already in a good position, then if it's in the position where you're going to just jump into the next knit, where you're going to do your knit stitch, then you can keep it there. Like for example, let me see if I'm understanding her right. What I'm guessing is I'm going to pretend I'm going to cast on here. So my guess is that she's doing this, but your needle is here if you do that. So you do have to remove it so that way you can put it into the correct position.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. I'm going to do this row with the yarn in my right hand, and then the next row I'm going to do it with the yarn in my left hand. Everything else is going to be the same. I'm still going to go into the stitch the same way. I'm still going to wrap my yarn around my needle the same way. I'm still going to come out the stitch the same way. I'm just going to hold my yarn in a different hand. And by knitting what's called continental, by holding my yarn in my left hand, that's really one of those things that typically crocheters will find really helpful, because a lot of right-handed crocheters will hold their yarn the same way when they crochet. So I'm essentially holding the yarn in my left hand the same way I do when I crochet. I'm looking at my knitting here. I'm still going into the stitch. I'm still going around my needle. See how it's still, I'm not going around like this, going around my needle. I come out the stitch and off. In, around, out, off. In, around, out, off. In, around, out, off. Both ways work just fine. You can decide which one works best for you. As you guys are practicing this beyond this class, you will find one that works best for you, and I say just go with it.
Amy says that her tail is on top instead of on the bottom like yours. What am I doing wrong?
All right, so she's just probably working her start like this. She just needs to just pull it down. Just make sure, just pull it down, like forcefully pull it down, so that way when you're knitting, you always want to make sure you're only looking at the stitches you're working into and your work is flowing down from the needles. Okay. What you're going to notice here is it looks like you're getting ridges, and you might be like, Marley, those look like a bunch of purl bumps. Well, yeah, they technically do, because they are the purl bump of a garter stitch, but it's actually, there's a knit stitch in there. If I separate these ridges, you can see there's like a V in there. So as you're turning back and forth, we're always knitting and we're creating what's called garter stitch. It's a very common stitch. Once you learn this stitch, you guys, there is a plethora of patterns out there using this. I know there are a ton on the Favecraft sites. There's some on my sites. I mean, there's just a whole bunch, but this is called garter stitch. Now we're going to continue to work in garter stitch, but this is a great time to take a quick break, and I'm going to let Jenny do a little talk through with you guys. All right, so just keep on knitting. You're going to be fine. I'm going to come over here. Do I go to the next slide or stay with this?
Yeah, let's do the next slide.
All right.
So I just wanted to show you guys again this great offer from our friends at I Like Knitting today. We did post the URL in the chat, and we will include it in all of our follow-up emails as well. But this is a great deal for you guys today. It's 75% off the regular price of almost $50. So for just $11.88, you guys can get a whole year worth of great patterns from I Like Knitting. And then we do have a poll. I'm just going to do the launch poll. So just a fun little poll. If you guys, can you see this poll? I think, hopefully, yeah, I think some people are answering. So just a fun little poll. How much did you spend on yarn supplies in the last 30 days? Just kind of something fun to play around with. But yeah, a couple other questions that we've gotten throughout the class, if regarding advanced classes, if we're going to be doing additional classes. We do have 3 advanced knitting classes coming up with Marley in a few weeks, and we will talk about that a little bit more towards the end of the class. But we have lace class on the books, as well as brioche knitting, and then cable knitting. So if you guys are having fun today, join us for our advanced knitting classes in a couple weeks. I'm going to close the poll. Thank you guys for voting. Kind of fun. Looks like the majority have spent under $25. So,
wow, I'm impressed.
I
I was the one down there in the $100 plus. That's where I was. Hey, no shame whatsoever. Okay, I'm hoping you guys are getting a little bit more comfortable with the yarn, whether it's in your right hand or left hand, and a little bit more comfortable with the stitches. So as you're working along, if you have a second to just kind of either give me a thumbs up or kind of let me know, how are you feeling? Hopefully it's not too bad, because the second part of this class, we're going to continue knitting, but I am going to do some troubleshooting that happens a lot with beginner knitters that typically causes them to want to quit because they feel like they're not good enough or there's a problem and I can't fix it. And you know what? That's just not the case. So I want to make sure you get some really simple troubleshooting things answered here. And then I also have a lot of troubleshooting videos on my own YouTube channel. You guys can always check out and ask questions there as well. Okay.
We are getting a lot of thumbs up and people are having a great time. Deb says, great class. I'm feeling inspired.
Good,
so.
Good.
2 thumbs up from Judy.
Fantastic. Well, and I will let you guys know with this little 10 stitch swatch, if you make it long enough, at the very end, you could just kind of whip stitch the cast on edge to your bind off edge and you could have yourself a little coffee cozy. So you can be like, look what I made with Marley. It's pretty easy stuff. All right, so I'm going to get through to the end of this row and I'm going to troubleshoot the very first thing that by this point, most of you are asking, which is the first stitch of my row is really loose. How do I tighten it up? All right. Well, you can see here, even mine is a little bit loose. That's perfectly normal and natural. One way you can tighten it up though, is when you're knitting the stitch. So you're going to go into the stitch, around the yarn, or around the needle, out the stitch and off. If you wiggle your needle and tug your yarn, it actually tightens the stitch below a little bit and it tightens the stitch that's on your needle. So a little wiggle and a tug is what will tighten that up. Now you want to be careful. You don't want to tighten that below stitch too much because then all of a sudden your edge will look like it's kind of puckered down, but it helps immensely with that side edge, just giving a little wiggle and a tug. Do you guys see how that works? I'm going to undo my work here and show you again. So I'm going to knit into this first stitch. And so I can see that stitch there is a little loose. So if I wiggle and a tug, it just tightens it up a little. See, just snugged it up ever just so slightly. So it's not super small, but yet my yarn around my needle is still nice and comfortable. It's not too tight. And I have a nice edge there. So that's typically one of the first questions people will ask because they want their knitting to look nice and tidy, right? You don't want it to look like a sloppy mess. And so that's the first way you can create a nice uniform look on your knitting. Okay, how do you guys like that one? Who is all doing a wiggle and a tug right now? Reminds me of a bushel and a peck, a bushel and a peck. It's cute. All right, so I'll do it again on this side here real quick. I go in, around, and out, and just a wiggle and a tug. Tightens it up. Makes it look
Christopher says,
nice.
I always have trouble with regulating tension. Do you have any tips?
I know this is going to just sound so cliche, but it's practice. You'll find a way to hold the yarn that works best for you. And if you can maintain control of that yarn, that will help you with tension. For me, I like to wrap the yarn around my pinky, and my pinky actually controls my tension a lot, like it controls how much yarn is getting used. So when I wrap those around my pinky, these other 3 fingers go underneath the yarn for me. And so I guess it's like I pinch my ring finger and my pinky. And so as I'm knitting and I go like this, and if I need more yarn, watch my pinky. I kind of extend it and it's like I let myself a little slack and I go. And I cannot tell you if that was something that was taught to me. I can tell you that it was probably something that I just started doing and I was like, oh, that works. You know what I mean? I have friends who wrap the yarn around their finger like this, and they knit. I have friends who, so I go underneath, they go this way and they knit. Whatever works for you. I know that's not the answer you probably want, but really practice is what's going to make perfect, because you're going to create that muscle memory in your hand. So play around with the different ways to hold your yarn. And if, as long as you can hold this tension here as consistent as possible, that's going to help you the most. I mean, even as I have to let go of my needles, I still have my tension on my yarn here. So I'm still able to control my tension. I will tell you another thing that I have learned. So you guys don't know this, but I am primarily a continental knitter where I hold my yarn in my left hand. So I had to teach myself how to hold my yarn in the right hand. And I found when I first started, I would knit with the yarn in my right hand and I would keep my yarn up here, and see how that pulls the row below up really high. So as now I've learned that I have to force my hand to be down here so that that row below goes to where it's supposed to be. And it's just a simple thing of my finger having to just be moved down, because my finger over here, I always have it right here. But when it's in this hand, I have to have it down more than up. You can see right there, I pull it up, it pulls that up and it shortens the stitch of this row. And I don't want that. I want that stitch to be down there where it's supposed to be. So that was one of those things that I learned as I transitioned to having, being able to be a thrower. Does that help anybody out there?
Yeah, we did have a lot of questions about, how to hold your yarn in the right and left hand. So thank you for going over that. We
Sure.
do
And
have questions as well about how to fix dropped
yep, I'm going to go
stitches.
to that next. I do want to show people. So I hold the yarn in my left hand also with my pinky. Apparently I really like my pinky, and I do let it have the control of everything. So even over here, like, so you can see up here, look, I hold my yarn. See how high my pinky is, or not my pinky, my forefinger is over here, as compared to over here, I have to keep it down. Can you guys see that? Is that even like, I keep it up higher than over here, I keep it down below the work a little bit. I don't know why, it makes a difference in where the stitches land. Okay, so before we go to the drop stitch, I'm going to start with what if you make an accidental yarn over? And that means that as we've been knitting, I didn't point this out specifically, but as we've been knitting, our yarn has been behind our needles, okay? It's back behind our needles. When you purl, we aren't learning purling today, but when you purl, your yarn is actually in front of your needles. But if you were to accidentally have your yarn in front of your needles and then go to knit a stitch, you get an extra stitch. You get an extra loop on your knitting needle, okay? That's called a yarn over. If you do that, congratulations, you're an advanced knitter, because you have jumped to lace knitting, because that's what it is, right? You've said, I don't want 10 stitches, I want 11, I'm going to create a yarn over. You've created an extra stitch. The good news is it's not the end of the world if you've created that extra stitch and need to get rid of it. The first thing you could do, if you catch it immediately, if you just finished the stitch, you're like, oh man, it looks like I have a hole there. It looks like there's just like this string laying right across my knitting needle. What do I do? Well, the first thing you could do is unknit that stitch you just did. And so what you would do here is the stitch you just knit is the loop that's on your right hand needle. And the stitch you let jump off of this is right down there. So think of this as this is the mother and this is the daughter, right? So we're going to take our left-hand needle and we're going to stick it right in the center of that mother, and we're going to let the daughter drop off the needle. Okay, you ready? I like to pull my stitches down so I can really see that mother stitch. I take my left-hand needle and I'm going to stick it right into that mother. And then the daughter, I'm going to let it fall off my right-hand needle. And look at that. My mother is back over here on my left needle. Here's that strand that I was talking about. So all I do is I let that fall off, make sure my yarn is in the back, and then I continue on knitting. And great, I no longer have this accidental yarn over. So if you catch it right away, you can unknit your work. Now, having said that, even if you don't have a yarn over and you need to unknit your work, you can do that for any reason you want. So to unknit your work, you're going to go through that mother stitch, okay? So I can go through the mother, let the daughter fall off. Go through the mother, let the daughter fall off. Go through the mother, let the daughter fall off. And I could do it with the yarn in my other hand too, just so you guys can see. Again, I always, can you see how it's like I pull I create tension so that I can really expand out that mother stitch to find it. So you go into the mother, let the daughter fall off. 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 You can even do it down here at the end. Into the mother, let the daughter fall off. And I just unknit that entire row. How many of you are practicing that right now? You're like, stab the mother, let the daughter fall off. Like, it just makes it super easy. That is one of the first ways you can fix mistakes. Now, I could continue doing that, like unknitting this entire thing. Like at this point, I would turn my work, because if you're going to unknit, you want your work in your right hand, right? So that way we can get the stitches back on our left needle. So I go into the mother, drop off the daughter, and it's the same thing. You guys see that? So if I just wanted to unknit, I could do this for the entire project until I fix whatever I want to do or whatever it is. And then I just continue on, make sure my yarn is in back, and I continue on knitting. Does everybody understand that? Okay, because that, I mean, that there, you guys, that is like knitting gold, because the number of people that have learned to knit that don't understand how to fix their stitches is amazing to me. So knowing how you can just do that simple act of unknitting is huge. That simple act of recognizing that yarn over and how to get rid of it if you find it immediately is huge. Now, I'm going to show you how to get rid of it if you don't find it until the next row, okay? So let's knit along. Knit, 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 and we're going to accidentally do our yarn over. So I bring my yarn forward. I'm going to knit. So it's like, oh, okay, my yarn's forward. I didn't pay attention. Now I knit, and I have this random yarn over there, but I don't see it right away. So I just keep on knitting. I'm like, la-di-da, everything's grand. I'm okay. Such a champion. Marley's the best teacher. Look at me go. Look at this fabric. Oh, I'm amazing. They should make me a prodigy. This is just stunning. And you get here and you're like, what the heck is that? Right? You're like, oh no, I spoke too soon. Well, you already know. You could be like, okay, first things first, is it a drop stitch? Look at your work down here. Do you see any random loops anywhere? No. So it's not a drop stitch. You don't have a hole because you have a drop stitch. Then you're looking at it. Okay, what else do I see? I see I have this random string of yarn. Okay, well, that would be called a yarn over. So it looks like I accidentally put that yarn over onto my needle. Well, how do I get rid of it? Well, could I knit it? Technically, yes, but that would give you one extra stitch and you would get a hole. So technically, yeah, I could knit this, but then I'm going to get a big hole. All right. I don't want that big hole. I just want to keep this nice, pretty garter stitch because I'm amazing, right? Remember, I'm a prodigy. So I look at this and I'm like, what do I do with this yarn over? Well, what if I just let it fall off? What happens there? Oh, it's kind of big, but I know that if I kind of work that slack into the stitches around it, it might just go away. That looks pretty good. So I continue on. I'm like, well, let's knit and see how it looks. So I knit a couple, knowing that I could unknit, right? And I'm like, well, looky there. Still a prodigy. I don't have a hole and I don't have a yarn over. I just let it drop off. When you only have one random yarn over and you let it drop off your needle like I did, the stitches around where that yarn over is can absorb that extra slack. And so right there is where that yarn over is, but the stitches on either side of it are absorbing the slack. Now, if I had many of those yarn overs, then this whole row would just look like really elongated stitches because it would have a lot of slack. But just one little random yarn over like that, I just let it drop off and it can go away. Boom, you just learned another fix. Like super easy. Okay, you guys with me on this? Yeah, baby. Okay, let's fix a stitch. I'm gonna hold the yarn over here.
Also, real quick, Pat is wondering, how do we count rows? I don't know if you're going to get to that.
Oh, okay. So wait, I can jump that right here. So we are talking, we are working in what I've been calling garter stitch this whole time. Okay, so it looks like we have these nice ridges. When you're working garter stitch, each ridge counts as 2 rows. Okay, so you could count just your ridges and be like, there's 2 rows, 4 rows, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. And then you get up here, I have 2 there. I'm getting ready to go to the next. So you count your ridges. If you are working in stockinette stitch, which is where it's a lot of V's, you would just count your V's going up. Remember when I said when we're working garter stitch, you can see the V's between the ridges. So like that's a V there. Okay. So if you think about it this way, this ridge is 1 purl row. This V there is one knit row, so to speak, because we're turning our fabric back and forth. So that's why it's like, if you count a ridge, it counts as 2. Does that make any sense? I mean, I know that's really confusing. It's actually one of those things that as you knit, it'll become more clear. Just kind of put that in the back of your mind and think to yourself, that'll become more clear later, but at least you've heard it once. But as you're counting rows in garter, you count these ridges. And for the most part, when you're following a knitting pattern, they will have you work to a certain distance instead of a certain number of ridges or rows. It's different than in crochet. So they tend to will say work until this measures 8 inches or whatever it is. Okay.
Cheryl's asking, do you count the top row on the needle?
You count the row on your needle, yes, because that row is already completed. It is a completed row. Yep.
Do you count the cast on as a row?
That is debatable. So rule of thumb is no, but there are some patterns that will tell you yes. So you really have to kind of read the pattern and use your general knowledge base, whether you want to count it as a row or not.
And Jackie is not sure how to find the mother stitch when unknitting. Okay.
Here's what I want you to do, Jackie. Whether you're knitting with the yarn in your right hand or left hand, I want you to put your yarn in your left hand and I want you to pull. And then I want you to take your right hand, I want you to grab your fabric, and I want you to pull it down. So we're going to stretch those stitches out. Okay, can you see I've stretched those stitches out? So that stitch right there that's on my right hand needle, that's my daughter. And as I pull my yarn, you see that how, so I pull that stitch there, it stretches that stitch below the daughter. That's my mother. That's why I wanted you to put the yarn in your left hand, because it really allows you to open up that mother stitch and you just stick your needle right in the center of that mother stitch and then let the daughter fall off. Hopefully that helps you.
Can you talk about the right side versus the back side and how you can?
Yeah, so that's a little bit tricky because in garter stitch, both it's reversible. So there really isn't a right side, wrong side, unless a pattern tells you, hey, this is going to be the right side or this is going to be the wrong side. In a stockinette stitch pattern, that's very obvious. For me, when I make the decision whether it's right side or wrong side, I usually will look at my cast on edge and I'm like, okay, maybe I'm going to hide that edge. Maybe I want this to be my very first row of my right side. So then I kind of make that decision on my own. Or I can look at this side, see that would be hidden, See how that kind of starts with those little bumps there if I hide that? So to me, this would be my back side. It's hard to talk about right side, wrong side with garter stitch, like I said, guys, because it's reversible. So a pattern would typically tell you this is the right side or this is the wrong side. The best thing you could do is get yourself, well, I don't want to use that. It's the same color. Get yourself some removable stitch markers. And when you start working on a pattern and the pattern says, okay, the side you're looking at as you're working. So that means as the yarn is in your left hand, as you're looking at it, it says, this is your right side. Take your stitch marker and just put that marker on the right side of your fabric, especially when the fabric is something like this, where it's reversible. And then, you know, every time you see that side, it's the right side. Or if this helps too, if you're trying to count, where it's like you have to work 2 rows, you're trying to keep track, you could say, okay, every time I see this marker, I know I have done, you know, I'm on my 2nd row. Does that make sense? So like I can keep that marker here and we could go and start knitting, and we'll just declare that as the right side. Okay. So I could say I am working the right side of this project and I'm knitting along. And full disclosure, like I move my pointer finger a lot more than other continental knitters. Other continental knitters typically will go and they move this hand a lot more to pick at it. I don't know why. It was a muscle memory thing, y'all. Like at some point in time, my body was like, I like this. So that's what I do. So now that I've completed that row, I turn my work. You see how I don't see that marker anymore? So now in my mind, I know I'm looking at the wrong side. Okay. So then I would just continue on knitting. Any more questions? Drop stitch.
We do have some questions. We are kind of approaching the end of time. We're at 1:53, so we've got about 7 minutes left.
Okay. Let me do a drop stitch real quickly, and then I'm going to show how to bind off, because you've done all this work, but you have to know how to finish it off, because if you took it off the needles now, it would all just like fall like a rut in your pantyhose. Okay. Now, a drop stitch with garter stitch is a little bit tricky because we do have purls and knits to deal with. So you guys don't know how to purl yet, so this is going to be a little bit tricky for you, but you can do it. Okay. I'm going to knit a couple stitches here just to get to the middle of the fabric. And let's say I'm talking and for some reason that falls off. Oh no, what do I do? Well, initially right here, if it hasn't dropped or created any sort of a run, I can just pop it right back onto my needle. So that's no big deal. But if it drops off, and let's say it comes undone just once, all right? So one string comes out. You're like, oh no, like you can see the loop, but there's also this string now. Well, the first thing I want you to do is stop that loop. Stop it from going anywhere. So I put it onto my right hand needle. You can put it on your left hand needle. If you have another one of these markers, put a marker in it, like do something so that it doesn't go any further. It's at that point you really have to figure out if this loop needs to go on this side of the fabric or this side of the fabric. Well, because we're working garter stitch, one thing that will help you is looking at the stitches on either side, and we're looking at purl bumps, right? And those stitches that we have already knit, they are knit stitches. Can you guys see the difference there? See how there are no bumps up along the knitting needle, but over here we have bumps right along the knitting needle. So that lets us know that this stitch that dropped was a quote unquote purl stitch. So this yarn has to be on this side. So what I do, so I have the drop stitch here. I grab the yarn that it fell out, right? So I'm just going to scoop it up. Now it just looks like a yarn over on my needle, doesn't it? Just looks like a yarn over. And what we're going to essentially do is very similar to a bind off that you guys are going to learn here in just a minute. I'm going to grab that stitch that fell off and let it jump up and over that strand of yarn. Hey, now that looks normal, okay? But you have to remember that that stitch fell off of this needle. If I continue knitting, look, I'd have another technically drop stitch, right? So I just want to make sure I put that stitch back over on my left-hand needle so that way I can work it, because my yarn is going to come from that stitch right there. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that, because I know you guys can go back and look at that in the recording. The other thing I want to mention is if you have to put your work down mid-row like this, you put it down, you walk away to maybe go walk the dogs or something, and you come back and let's say you pick it up and you're like this, you're like, okay, I'm going to start knitting. And you notice that your yarn is over here, but you're like, it's okay. And you're just like, okay, I just got to make sure it's in back so that I am knitting, and you start knitting. What you're going to notice is you've picked up your work and you've gone the wrong direction. And you might be like, well, now I have a hole. How do I fix that? How did Marley say to fix that? Is there a stitch to drop? Did I drop a stitch? Do I need to fix that? Like, what do I do? Okay, because it's obvious something is wrong there. Well, the news here is that the only way to fix that is to unknit it and get back to that point and pick up your work correctly. So let's go ahead and unknit that real quick. So I'm just going to unknit those stitches. And the key here is when you put down your work mid-row, which I highly recommend not doing, is, see how tricky that one is? This is one of those ones I would undo. I would let the daughter fall off and then put in the mother. This is where we picked it up. You see where the yarn is attached to the left-hand needle? That was my first clue that I had picked this up wrong. When you pick up your work mid-project, if you had to put it down for some reason and you're picking it back up, make sure when you pick it up, your working yarn is coming off of the stitch on your right-hand needle, okay? That's the only thing there. If you're gonna pick up your project mid-project, make sure your yarn is attached to that last stitch on your right-hand needle. Now, if you're at the end of the project like this, that's no big deal. And of course, when you put this in your left hand, it's gonna be the first stitch there, but there's nothing over here. I'm talking about when you have one on both, okay? So we've reached the end of whatever you're gonna do. Like, you don't have to bind off right now, you guys, but let me show you how to do this. Let's say you wanna continue making this and make it a coffee cozy or something. You can absolutely do that. But when you're ready to finish, you have to bind off the stitches. Just like we cast on, we need to finish these stitches and have them bind off. So you essentially kind of have them leapfrog one over the other. And again, we're still knitting. So I'm going to knit 2 stitches to begin with. So I knit 1 and I knit 2. Now what I want to do, notice again, I pull that down. I'm going to take this left-hand needle. I'm going to go into the stitch that is second away from the tip of the needle. I'm going to go in and I'm going to have this stitch here jump up and over that one. So I'm just going to come up and have it jump up and over. And I'm left with 1 stitch. Now I'm not going to tighten. I'm not going to do anything else. Otherwise that makes it too snug. So now I'm left with 1 stitch. So I go into the next one and I knit it. And I have that back stitch jump up and over the front stitch. Knit the next one on my left-hand needle, back stitch, jump up and over the front stitch. And I do this all the way to the end of my row. If you find that your stitches are too snug when you bind off, you could use a larger needle to bind off. There are other bind offs out there in the world, everybody. So as you become more proficient knitters and come across other bind offs, they are out there. But this is the most common bind off. You're going to see it's almost like working a slip stitch row in crochet. And when you get to the last one, you have that jump over that one. You simply cut your yarn. Here's a pro tip: add a pom-pom to your scissors. You won't lose them. Always leave a nice long tail, at least 4 to 6 inches. And on this last one here, just pull it up, give it a tug, and it's secured in place. And that's your bind off. You guys see all that? Okay. If you're going to weave in your ends, best thing to do, take your tapestry needle, thread it on, and on the wrong side, so we've already established that that's going to be our right side, I come to the wrong side, and what I like to do is I kind of trace the stitch here. So I can come in here, come behind there, and just follow the stitch. Just trace where the stitch goes, and you can weave in your ends pretty easily. And that's it, everybody. You could use these skills that we learned today in this 1 hour and go out there and make a ton of different what are called garter stitch projects, whether it's a hat, a scarf, fingerless mitts, a coffee cozy. I mean, everything you want is available using just the knit stitch. Once you work this down this way a little bit, I always work it back a little bit that direction and then snip it. And that's it. That is how you knit.
Right.
Once you've,
awesome.
I was gonna say, once you've mastered this, the next thing to learn is the purl, and then that's it. You can do anything.
That was fantastic. We it is 2 o'clock. We are technically out of time. We can. Do you want to try going to the next slide, Marley, real quick, and we can talk advanced classes? Then we can do some.
Why can't I do a share screen? I'm like, where's my share screen? Yes, here we go.
Okay, so this is the information about the advanced knitting classes that we have coming up. Let's see here. On the 19th, we're doing the twist and turn knit cables class. On the 26th is intro to lace knitting. And then on February 2nd is intro to brioche knitting. So the URL is down here at the bottom that you can sign up to any one of those classes. They are paid classes, so they're $19.99 per class, or you can buy all 3 classes for $29.99, which is actually the best deal. It's about 50% off the whole bundle. And you don't have to attend in real life if you have a time conflict that day. Again, we are going to be recording those classes as well and emailing them out to the participants afterwards. So if you're like, oh, I want to attend one, but I can't attend the other one, that's okay. You can, if you sign up and buy the bundle, we'll still email you all of the classes afterwards. We did have some questions. Some we got to live, some we haven't gotten to quite yet. We'll try to do a couple real quick right now. Sure. If you still have questions, feel free to reach out to me after the class as well, and I can try to get them answered for you from Marley. Marley, do you want to go to the next slide real quick?
Sure can.
Okay, so this is my contact information as well as Marley, where to find her on all the different social media channels. She has a wonderful YouTube channel, lots of great videos. Favecrafts.com is another great resource. Allfreeknitting.com is another great free resource. We have tons of free patterns on both of those websites. Plus, one more time, here's the I Like Knitting magazine offer, $11.88. It's a great deal. That offer will be good through the end of the weekend. Let's see. We did have a couple quick questions if you guys want to stick around. Someone was wondering, Marley, do you have any tips for finding the end of a new skein of yarn? What is the trick?
Okay, so if you're looking, there's always different ways to get your yarn, whether you're going to pull it out from the outside of the ball or the inside of the ball. Now, here is a little known fact. Balls of yarn are actually supposed to be pulled on the outside. That's why it's so tricky to find the yarn from the inside. Now, that's not to say you cannot pull from the inside. You absolutely can, but you're going to have to deal with what I like to call yarn barf, right? And it's just because you're just going to pull out more of a clump of yarn where the tail is. But once you work through that little bit of yarn, you have, it's really easy just to work through it. What I will usually do is if I'm looking at I don't even have one here, a skein of yarn that's like this direction, like a burrito, I like squish the burrito this way. Does that make sense? I squish it and then I put my fingers in and I kind of try and feel around for, I don't know how else to call it, like a little nugget. It's what I call it, like a nugget of yarn. And that's usually like in that nugget is where the one little strand will be. And so I'll pull out that nugget knowing I have some yarn barf and I'll work through it. So that's my amazing advice. Squish your burrito and look for the nugget.
I like it. I love it. Lynn said, I have a tendency to knit too tightly. Should I just size up a needle?
You absolutely could do that. But Lynn, I would also encourage you what I said about when I learned English style, where I was pulling the yarn up too much, which pulled up the yarn below the stitch that was on my needle. And that makes your stitches too tight. So maybe try just moving your finger down a little bit more and not when you're knitting, allow the stitch on your knitting needle to be essentially a full circle instead of just a little line. Give that a try. If that does not work, then absolutely go up a needle size and give that a whirl.
Okay. One more question from Teresa. How can I hold my knitting to avoid knitter's elbow?
Oh gosh, I don't necessarily know if that's a matter of holding your knitting. You could try a bunch of different ways to knit. So I showed you today English and continental. There's also Portuguese and Scottish, or in your armpit. And there's Oh, it's a knitting. I can't think of what it's like, a knitting garter sort of thing that there are other people that do. There's lots of different ways. The most important thing, honestly, is to get up and stretch and make sure you're moving and working out with different movements, different motions. I know that for myself, I go from English to continental, and then I will also transition over to crochet to try and use different muscles. And then there's a wonderful woman named Marcy who does yoga for knitters. It's like yoga for the knotted knitters, what she calls it. And she's on YouTube, and it's really super easy. You're like sitting in your chair, and it's simple stretches, and just stretching at least every 30 minutes, you guys, is so incredibly important because it allows you to not get injured doing something that you love. But yeah, yoga for knotted knitters, I think is what it's called. It's amazing. It's really simple, but it's great. Like, that would be my biggest advice.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, like I said, if you guys have any questions that we have not gotten to, feel free to reach out directly and we will try to get them answered for you. Thank you all so much for being here. I know that, some people got it a little bit more quickly than others. We will be sending out a recording of this class today to everyone so you can practice. But like Marley said earlier, please give yourself grace. This is a new skill that you guys are learning. This first step to learning how to knit was coming here today. So
That's right.
Be on
That's right.
track. So just be patient with yourself. It is a new skill. Like everything in life, you just gotta, practice makes perfect.
Just practice. Give yourself like 15 minutes a day. Just pick it up and start working on it. Like, just give yourself a chance to create that muscle memory. That's what you're striving to achieve, is the muscle memory. From then on, it's like, oh, this is cake. So you can do this. You can do
Marley
it.
makes it look easy. So. She's been doing this for many, many years.
I will let you guys know, when I first learned to knit, I am not even joking with you, I threw it across the room and hit the wall because I was so frustrated with it. So when I tell you I understand, I completely understand. So just give yourself some grace.
Yes. All right. Well, like I said, thank you guys so much for being here. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, we are going to call it a day. So have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. And thank you, Marley.